Good day to everyone joining this very special conversation hosted by the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council. My name is Irfan Nooruddin. I am the director of the South Asia Center. And on behalf of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council, I welcome you to a conversation about South Asia's economic response to COVID-19. We are joined by three very distinguished public intellectuals and who will be sharing their insights on the three major economies of South Asia. From Delhi, Yamini Aiyar, President and CEO of the Center for Policy Research, the preeminent think tank in Delhi and in India at large. From Washington, D.C., Uzair Younus, a non-resident senior fellow with the South Asia Center, an advisor to the South Asia practice at Albright Stonebridge. And from Normal, Illinois, Professor Ali Riaz, a distinguished professor at Illinois State University and also a non-resident fellow, senior fellow at the South Asia Center. Ali will be talking primarily on Bangladesh. Pakistan will be covered by Uzair, and India's economic response focused on by Yamini. But of course, given that we have tremendous expertise amongst all three, the conversation will focus on what the lessons each country is teaching others, both good and bad, could be. So this is a conversation about South Asia as a whole. Welcome, all three of you, and thank you so much for making the time. I want to start really by just getting the core facts for our audience. What should we know about each country's response on purely economic terms to the crisis and the economic downturn that it has caused? Yamini, perhaps we can start with you and maybe a summary of what India has done thus far.
Sure. Firstly, Irfan, thank you very much for having me. In ordinary circumstances, I was meant to be in DC probably today, actually. So, well, if we can't be here physically, at least you've given me the opportunity to feel like I'm in DC. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It's been a difficult time for India. The virus hit us at a time when the economy was, in any case, going through a significant slump. We had experienced the lowest growth in GDP this quarter in a long time. Consumption was down, particularly rural consumption, according to surveys that the government hadn't released but were leaked. That gave us a sense that consumption was down for the first time in at least 4 decades. So in fact, there was some hope that the economy was sort of bottoming out and we were slowly going to enter into a period of a positive growth. And then the virus hit. So it's in that context that our economic reaction is evolving. But what happened in India is that I think partially because our public health infrastructure is phenomenally weak and in fact far weaker than our neighbors. I would argue that India has a lot more to learn from Bangladesh, frankly, than India is willing to admit on this front. And a sense that a crowded population like ours, if this lends itself to community transmission, things are going to get very, very bad, that our government reacted quite quickly to move in the direction of a lockdown. And in fact, that's really been the focus. So about a week ago, our Prime Minister came on television and announced a curfew for a day, which many interpreted as a preparation for what was to come going forward. And within 24 hours or thereabouts, he was back on television announcing a 21-day lockdown. In the interim, for listeners who aren't familiar with India, this is a union of states. We are a federal country. And one of the things about India is that there is a lot of interstate migration for casual labor. And this interstate migration doesn't get effectively counted in our policy process. We don't have enough data. We don't. These workers tend to be invisible to how we think about our cities and how we make policy. And as states began tackling this problem, there were clusters where the virus was beginning to sort of spread. Many state governments began to slowly close down their borders and announce versions of their own lockdowns. So there was a lot of confusion. And it was in the midst of this confusion that our Prime Minister announced a nationwide lockdown. And the immediate reaction of a large number of India's migrants was to say, given that things are dire and economic activity has come to a standstill, we want to go home. And so for the first week of the lockdown, we saw an unprecedented movement of people trying to make their way back home, and absent public transportation, railways shut down as well. Many chose to make their way back home on foot, creating a wide degree of chaos on the road. And in many ways, our economic response, I think, was shaped by this. No one, at least our policymakers certainly, didn't seem to have anticipated what the impact of this nationwide lockdown announcement would be on people and would be on the immediateness of what it would entail for our economy. And so the first step, I think rightly so, that our finance minister, the union government's finance minister has taken, was in thinking through what are the kinds of safety nets we need to put in place immediately to ensure that we don't end up in destitution and starvation, which is an immediate concern, given what we saw on the streets, given that it was very clear that the minute you stop all economic activity, the first people that are going to be hit are India's poor. And most of those poor were choosing to try and find ways and means of getting home. And so the first thing that has been done was on Tuesday last week, a relief package was announced. And that relief package focused largely on providing for a combination of food security to the poor, as well as some amount of cash transfers to ensure that there is some liquidity for the poor in the system. This has been widely criticized, firstly because it simply wasn't enough. While the US and the UK were announcing large fiscal stimulus, the announcement from the Indian government was what essentially was a very, very small amount, 1.73 lakh crores. We still don't know the degree of economic damage, and this is an evolving situation. So at this point, generosity may have signaled something, but our government, at least at the center, chose to be a lot more prudent about what they were putting. And it seems like it's very much a reallocation and an advancing of pre-planned government expenditure rather than an increase into the system. State governments, on the other hand, who were really tasked with the process of having to both ensure food security and some safety net, as well as build up our health systems, have been a little more generous. But for not to get too complicated about the nature of our federal system, states do not have much in terms of their taxation powers. And about 4 years ago, India signed up to a goods and services tax, which further reduces wiggle room and fiscal space for states. They also have to get central government, union government clearance before they can expand, before borrowing. And as a consequence, states really don't have the fiscal powers to create fiscal space to provide for the kind of expansive protections that are needed at this moment. So the expectation was we'd get a lot more from Government of India. Two important moves that have happened in the last day, actually today itself, our central bank has increase the limits on ways and means advancements. And that, I think, is an important step forward, which will allow a little more fiscal wiggle room for states. There is a general view that at this point, fiscal deficits are not things that we should be too worried about, because we have to ensure that we move money and we move money well. So a lot of the conversation right now in India is very much about how we can move money sensibly in a way that we ensure food security and social protection. Some thinking about how we can get the supply chain moving. That was, again, an unexpected consequence of the lockdown. To be honest, for the listeners, in my personal opinion, I think the lockdown was just really badly planned. It didn't think through all the different elements that were going to come in place. So what's happened right now is that even there was a lot of confusion about what goods could move. So essential goods, what was defined as an essential good. But even more importantly, truckers don't have drivers, and they don't have any access to labor. So the movement of the supply chain, even for these essential goods, is currently quite sporadic. There are some pockets where it's moving better than others, and bureaucrats and business are still trying to figure this out. And so that's really where the big focus has been. The country is still waiting for a big fiscal stimulus that is expected, certainly, but we are waiting to see when that will come. So those are the facts on the ground as I see them for the moment. The big concern, so right now we are focusing on these 21 days. The next question that we will have to confront is, post these 21 days, if we have some relaxation in the lockdown, what happens to ensure a certain degree of recovery? And then, of course, there's the big question of, once we get past this immediate phase, what happens in terms of a full-on economic recovery? I think we're not there yet in our thinking. Our policymakers right now are just grappling with the chaos that has unfolded in India over this last week.
Yamini, thank you. That was comprehensive and really well done. And as you pointed out, something maybe we can come back to for all of the countries, this was not going to be an easy year for India's economy in the best of times. There was a lot of us predicting a slowdown, a stuttering economy, and so this has just got to compound all of that. Ali, from the perspective of Bangladesh, what would your summary of the facts on the ground be from Dhaka's perspective?
Thank you. As for the Bangladesh, it came exactly like what Yamini was mentioning with respect to India, is that it came at a very bad time because the Bangladesh economy was on the downturn. A lot of indicators were clearly showing that it is going on the downwards, except one indicator, that is the remittance, which is one of the major source of the revenue for Bangladesh. Bangladesh's economy largely depends on two major revenue sources. One is the garments industry, the ready-made export-oriented garments industry, and the second is the remittances. So already the garments manufacturers were facing problem. Overall, the macroeconomy was facing problem, and it came at a very bad time. So it hit hard, and it is absolutely going to hit hard devastatingly to Bangladesh economy. If we look at the ADB's anticipation, it would be about $3.2 billion that Bangladesh is going to lose. So with that in context, what the Bangladesh government, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, did on 25th of March, she declared a sort of a package mostly focusing on the export-oriented industry. Largely, it is towards the garments manufacturers, which is about $59 million, 5,000 crore taka, which is equivalent roughly $59 million. But this allocation is very, very small, very timid, because if you look at the GDP, it is 0.2% of the GDP, Bangladesh last year, which is absolutely, small compared to what it is. It is one of the lowest in terms of, if we look at the other countries, it is one of the very lowest in the Asia Pacific region. So this 5,000 crore taka that has been allocated, it is largely focusing, and it is specifically mentioned that it would be towards export-oriented industries. But there is only one, BGME, MEA, that is Garments Manufacturer Association. There's the facts that they're providing, the statistics, that they would need 80% of that. That leaves other export-oriented industries practically nothing. Even the other part of the garments industry, for example, knitwear manufacturer, they have the similar kind of demand necessity. On the one hand, already we have seen more than $2 billion, possibly close to $3 billion of orders in the garments industry has been already cancelled or suspended. And this is what is in the economic front. The government had added few things to it. For example, they have expanded the existing safety net, providing cheap food. In some cases, it is providing free meals as well, but these are not too organized. And what is happening at this point, that it is hitting hard most of the people who are on the middle class, who are on the low income group, because there's nothing that is directly targeted to them. There are sporadic measures, but this is not going to do much of a help to them. And particularly when the government's initiatives are not helping in keeping them in a place where they would have the direct access to these resources. What happened is the government decided to do what they're describing as holiday. basically declaring and sending people from Dhaka. Almost 1 million people, or more than that, have left. Actually, about 9 million people have left Dhaka. Most of them are basically low-wage workers. Bangladesh economy depends on the informal labor. The informal economy is almost more than 70%. How do you reach them at this point? There is no plan whatsoever. So it is a very timid, immediate response. Even for this 5,000 crore taka that has been allocated, the bureaucracy, the wrangling of the bureaucracy, how to distribute it is going on. So, but most importantly, two things have happened that is very worrying. One thing is that the regular public health system seems to have collapsed because of the fear, because of the non-accessibility, and then the government is in many ways is not doing the testing, very poor number of testing. That means that it is the extent of the transmission we don't know. Given that the holidays, the people have gone to the villages. Now the entire village healthcare system is very poor, almost non-existent. Now they are facing a situation where neither they have help from the government nor they can be attended by the public system. Even in Dhaka, people are going around and cannot find a hospital where they can be tested. So this entire economic situation is not only a matter of reviving the economy, it is also a matter of healthcare system. And what they have done, they have not allocated new money from the budget. They have taken out about 250 crore taka to put it in the health system, which is roughly about 11, $12 million. That is not sufficient. And there is absence of PPE, absence of the mask, absence of the test kit. All these things are making it a very difficult situation. And there is a liquidity crisis. Already there is a liquidity crisis because people don't have the money. And if you look at the large number of people who are dependent on everyday basis wage, where are they going to get those money? So the current focus is very timid, very skewed towards only one sector. And unless it is expanded soon enough, there is going to be a very difficult and possibly a very, very dangerous situation, and very much hitting the low income and the middle class mostly in the country, which is very large indeed.
Thank you, Ali. Again, it's interesting thinking about the similarity with Yamini's point about the sense that at the end of the day, the initial response has been maybe more timid and maybe marked by a lack of full understanding of just how big this was going to have to be. And so it's a theme I'd like to come back to. But before we do that, Uzair, you just have written recently and also commented on your podcast about Pakistan's response. So could you summarize that for us, please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And I think what Yamini and Ali said about the timing of this, right, in terms of coming at a time when the economy, whether it's in India or Bangladesh, was really weak. I think this crisis probably came at the worst time for the Pakistani economy because it was only now beginning to recover from about 18 months of crisis where economic stability was finally being restored. The country was in an IMF program, and things could not have been worse in terms of the timing of this crisis. And there was confusion similar to what we saw in India and Bangladesh in terms of what to do initially as this crisis unfolded. And to its credit, the federal government, while it was slow to react on the public health side, the healthcare system across the provinces was stretched thin. It really did the most it could have possibly done to roll out stimulus measures, relief packages to help the vulnerable. And I think that is a testament to the fact that, Prime Minister Imran Khan's concern for the vulnerable segments of society in terms of what would happen in a lockdown was really showcased in terms of this package. So, for example, if you look at India's GDP, it's about 8.5, 9 times that of Pakistan, depending on how you use the numbers. But Pakistan's stimulus or India's stimulus for this COVID-19 so far at the federal government level is only about 3 times that of Pakistan. So while India's is $23 billion, Pakistan's is $7.5 billion already. And they've pulled out all the big guns in terms of making sure that the vulnerable segments of society are protected as best as they can possibly be given this crisis. So, for example, the core of the 1.2 trillion package that was announced, a rupee package that was announced by the government, deals with helping out the poor. And so 35 million households, about 35% of total households, about 12 million in total, will be benefited under this scheme, which is about 12,000 rupees as a one-time cash payment for 4 months. That will really help cover the food and ration costs for these households. 4.5 million of those 12 million will be existing recipients of the Benazir Income Support Program, which falls under the SARS program umbrella. They've relaxed the criteria for an additional 4 million households to bring them into that net. And then another 3.5 million households will be found through an SMS-based scheme that will be mapped against the Nadra ID system, which is Pakistan's equivalent of the Indian Aadhaar system, to make sure that additional households are given that money that they need. At the same time, provinces are doing their own bit to make sure that the effect of this crisis are dampened as best as they could. So, for example, Punjab rolled out a 10 billion rupee package. KPK rolled out an 11.4 billion package, and other states are working through their own metrics. The state bank on the monetary side was initially criticized for not doing enough, but in the last couple of weeks, overall, it has cut interest rates by 225 basis points. So the interest rate has gone, the policy rate has gone from 13.25% to 11%. And again, it's this whole of government approach that's being deployed on the economic front to make sure that the crisis is dealt with early on. Will that be enough? I don't think so. I think there will be more needed in the coming days. And the data points to a really terrible situation. So Pakistan, for example, already has over 2,100 confirmed cases, many more probably out there because testing is not as aggressive as it should be. The healthcare system is stretched. And again, similarly to what we've seen in India, migrant labor has slowly started going back, although we haven't seen a crisis of sorts in terms of what we've seen in North India, primarily again because of the fact that the lockdown in the Pakistani case, where you know, on the side there was a concern that we can't do it aggressively enough. Still is concern around that, and we can critique that. But since, for example, first shut down schools, then it shut down marriages and marriage halls, then restaurants and malls were shut down, and eventually everything else was locked down in a way to have some balance to it. So I think that sort of dampened the immediate crisis of migrant labor rushing back home, and we haven't seen a lot of that. But for Pakistan, the biggest issue is that it relies, much like other economies in South Asia, on indirect taxation. And we're already seeing as the economic engine sort of comes to a screeching halt, demand is collapsing. And so in electricity, demand is down 30%. Petroleum demand is down 60%. Gas demand is down 50%. Refineries are shutting down. So again, this indirect tax engine that Pakistan relies on to make sure that it continues to run its fiscal deficit or maintain its fiscal deficit is just not there right now. So it'd be very difficult, I think, for the government to continue providing additional fiscal stimulus measures, although it needs to, and I think more can be done and should be done. But so far, what the government has done, at least from my perspective, is far more than what anyone anticipated, given that it's in an IMF program, given all the other fiscal issues that the country has. And I think that, again, is testament to the fact that the government recognized that the economic impact of this lockdown, of this crisis, will be very, very severe, particularly on the vulnerable segments. And they've done enough, I think, for the time being to show that they're really going after this crisis in a serious way.
Thank you, Uzair. That was very, very useful. Before we go into the questions, I just want to remind those participating and listening to these wonderful insights that we welcome your questions. Please use the chat window to share your questions. We will be taking them as they come, and I'll pose them to our panelists. In many ways, one of the big commentaries that's happening globally is, of course, whether or not the public health measures that we understand to be the most effective, expansive testing, social distancing, contact tracing, are actually viable given the context of South Asia, right, in which we live in much more densely occupied. Right? The average square feet available to citizens of South Asia is an order of magnitude less than it is to those of us living in the United States. So just the entire pure logistics of this are different. And then, as you have all commented, the very different profile of what it means to be vulnerable in terms of daily wage laborers, access to food, the lack of refrigeration, etc. So the public health measures are going to have to be amended and sort of adopted. The economic measures, on the other hand, potentially could have a more common playbook. And thinking about the United States and the $2 trillion, first stage fiscal stimulus, one feature that seems different, and I'd love to get feedback and comments from you on this, is the fact that the United States focused a lot more on bailouts and relief for big companies that were going to face economic dislocation because of what has happened to their businesses. Most of what the comments that you have offered so far have focused instead on the emphasis of the governments to protect the most vulnerable, to provide income relief, to put money in the hands of average citizens, which arguably the United States has not done quite as much of. Can you talk a little bit, and we'll start again maybe with Yamini over here, on what you're hearing, what you're anticipating the government is likely to do directly for businesses, big and small, either now or in the coming months as they respond to this crisis?
So, Irfan, in fact, there were many big question marks in everyone's minds until the finance minister came to do her press conference with this with the relief package that she had to offer, about who was going to be priority first. So I think that all our governments, and particularly I should speak for mine, you have to give them credit for focusing on the critical issue right now, which is, and that's the first step they've taken. What they do with big business, I think, is going to be a big question mark. We don't really know, and we don't really know because in any case, demand was at an all-time low in India before the crisis hit, and many of our core drivers of the economy, take automobiles for instance, all of them were facing a demand crisis prior to where we have ended up, and were looking to see whether stimulus packages would be given to them from government. Also, we were suffering from another problem, which is related to which is related to the sort of banking crisis that had come about. And so the credit lines had totally broken down on account of over leveraging of banks by our industry. So it's in that context that now I think the big question is, what will we do and how will we do it? I think for the moment, the real focus for the government is going to have to be on what to do with the small and medium enterprises. Because really those are the big employers in terms of just the sheer numbers of workers, right? And that's not an easy one to solve because a large number of these small and medium industries, particularly the small ones, don't have registered workers. So, beyond 10 to 15 because of the complexity of our labor laws. So I think what we will need to do first is to open out credit lines as much as possible for small and medium, and then think about what can be done with big business going forward. And my sense is that that's how the government is going to go. I think we'll have to wait to see how long this current health crisis is going to take us before we can at least get the economy back somehow. I also think the more sensible thing to do would be to ensure that whatever bailout package we build ensures that at least salaries, 3 months of salaries for workers are provided for. And then we can see what we do to be able to stimulate businesses to get back on their feet.
I ask you, Yamini, a quick
Irfan, if I may
question
add to this.
Actually, Ali, 1 second. If I could ask a question maybe for all of you, but I'd love to get Yamini's take right away. And this is a question from one of our audience. I mean, in all of South Asia and definitely in India, government has often criticized that much of the money that it allocates to relief efforts for the poor never actually make it to the poor, right? The amount of leakage in the system is huge. Is there any talk and discussion right now of ensuring that the money that is being allocated in these stimulus packages actually gets to the intended recipients? So Yamini, maybe you could just take a quick minute to give us your thoughts, and then I'd love to get Ali and Uzair's thoughts on that particular question as well.
Sure. So, in ordinary times in India, this issue of leakage is always front and center and often comes up as a reason why we should not be doing large, expansive social protection because money goes away into the wrong hands. And I think one of the good things in the public discourse right now is that no one is worried about corruption. Everybody feels that we have a serious problem on our hands and we need to figure out how best to just get things going so that at least a semblance of protection is provided for. And I think that there are two reasons why we should be less worried about it. One, that over the course of the last few years, I would say decade plus, a number of state governments have taken quite important steps towards reforming their public distribution system. That's the mechanism by which food grains and ration reaches the poor. And they have found innovative ways of trying to not remove, but at least reduce leakage in the system. So there is a little bit of faith now that, at this moment of crisis, the PDS system, although many had been arguing that we should just get rid of it altogether and use cash, I think right now everyone is heaving a sigh of relief that it exists, because there are steps in the chain that everybody is familiar with, and we can use those to get things moving. And similarly for hot food and community kitchens, all of which are very much on the cards. We also use technology to build a banking network, right? So the the Jan Dhan system, which allows for direct benefit transfers, is now going to come in handy. But it brings another question, which is that even though banks have sort of the zero balance bank accounts, which is the Jan Dhan Yojana, have sort of spread across the country, people's access to the banking system and ability to use it is quite limited. So in fact, there are many suggestions on the table right now from those who work particularly in rural areas about trying to rethink that and seeing, are there ways by which we can just physically actually get cash into people's hands, and using the local governments as a means by which we can do this. So there will be leakage. Look, I mean, let's be realistic about this. But at this point, that shouldn't be a reason why we shouldn't be generous and move. And I think the biggest criticism that the Indian government is confronting right now is that the relief package, we're not even talking about the stimulus package right now. The relief package that they have on offer is not generous enough for the challenge that states are facing. The other big issue is that state finances, owing to the economic crisis and the tightening of fiscal space in India over the last couple of years, and especially acute last year, and low GST collections added to that, is that state finances are so weak right now that states are having difficulty even paying out salaries to their own employees. So in moments of crises, actually, governments tend to be employers of first and last resort. And a lot of the way in which we were thinking of creating stimulus in the economy up till a month ago was more public investment in infrastructure that would also help bail out the big infrastructure companies and so on, and revive the private sector. None of that is possible right now. So in the immediate, in fact, states are now writing to the center saying we need grants so that we can pay our salaries because we just don't have the funds to do that. So right now we are looking for ways of just expanding fiscal space so that basic public finance necessities are being met, and then we'll come to the next generation of problems. And I think thinking about corruption now is not something that we should worry too much about.
Thank you. Ali, responses to either of those, the question of what is being done for businesses, and then whether or not, what is being done to ensure that leakage is minimized to the extent that it's a concern?
There are three things here. First of all, the issue of the SMEs. In case of Bangladesh economy, SME, as Yamini mentioned with respect to India, SME is the primary employer. It is not so organized as we would have seen in case of United States or United Kingdom. But SME remains the central point, small and medium enterprises. So at this point, focusing on SME is absolutely necessary, which I don't see in the package that has been offered by the government. I presume that there will be something coming down the pipe, because it is necessary. Without that cannot be in any form or fashion can this economy run at this point in Bangladesh. That needs to be taken into account, and their modalities needs to be sorted out as soon as practically possible. Now, I mentioned that the response has been timid. Why that has been, that needs to be clarified as well. Because the government seems to be not acknowledging the extent of this problem. There is a trust deficit between the government and the citizen. Primarily, what the government is trying to tell that it is very much limited, whereas there is reasons to believe that it is not. It is the community transmission has started. So if you have a large package, it practically indirectly acknowledges that the problem is big. And possibly government is not trying to do that one at this point. So it becomes a political decision as to what you do. And that is why reaching out to this question of SME becomes as central to me, because the large sectors and the large corporate ones can be taken care of. They have a cushion to actually absorb at this point, or should be having a cushion, which SMEs don't have. And again, going back to my primary and central point is the vulnerable population, and who have now been pushed into the villages where there is nothing left in terms of the infrastructure, both public health and economic activity. And the third point with respect to this issue of the corruption. Now, there is no doubt the question is there, and particularly when you have a government whose transparency and accountability is very tenuous. You'd see this one, and it has been an issue in Bangladesh, particularly over the last decade. Bangladesh has faced the question of corruption all along, and particularly over the last 10 years or so, we have seen the extent of it. Now, how that is going to be addressed? Should we be more concerned? I am, as opposed to Yamini, I'm a little bit more concerned about that. Because if the money is out there, but it is not reaching out, so what can be done? There are other ways. One is involving the large NGOs in case of Bangladesh. Am I saying that they are perfect? I'm not suggesting they're perfect. It is not the job of the NGO, but it is a very difficult and unusual time that you can. So this partnership needs to be built with the NGOs in reaching out to avoid, in some ways, perhaps create a sense of accountability, sense of transparency. That could be one way to do that one. Other organizations can be involved as well. But that should not take away or justify in any way, despite the unusual circumstances, we cannot let it go like this, that, okay, it's going to happen. We may accept that it is going to happen, but the transparency and particularly the corruption issue needs not to be pushed away for one and only one reason. If the money is not reaching out to the people who are vulnerable, who needs it, then what is the use of having this, whatever we call it, whether we call it the stimulus package or we call it a relief package, whatever we do. But more importantly, the government in case of Bangladesh needs to immediately accept and acknowledge the extent of it and interject and intervene, because so far it looks like that from the top all the way to the down, that there is a sense that, oh, it's going to go away. It's not going to go away. And understanding that either whether or these or that would help Bangladesh. If it does, fine. But the absence of the preparation and economy, absence of testing, absence of allowing people to be treated through the public healthcare system is a very dangerous combination at this point.
Thank you, Ali. Uzair, quick take on the business.
Irfan, I just wanted to make a very quick 2-second interjection on the corruption thing. So here's one way of thinking about it, right? Like, I think for the first time in recent history, the only visible actor out on the streets right now is government. Right? There's no one else. There is, the usual way in which citizen-state relationships are brokered, particularly in the local level, where middlemen, informal workers, there's a whole set of actors that play this game. at least at least for this immediacy of these 21 days, those middlemen and those actors actually are all going to find it much harder to play, because the government is very visible, and particularly the law and order elements of the government in India, at any rate, are very visible. I think one layer of corruption is perhaps not going to be as able to intervene as they would have ordinarily. But another thing that governments could do, if they are, as we get worried about corruption, maybe to preempt possible corruption, is the fact that government is speaking to people right now a lot. Like, just while this conversation was going on, I don't know if you all caught it, but the police sirens were beeping around the colony I live in Delhi, and everybody is being told, go home, don't be outside. This is a time to say, these are the packages that the government is announcing, so that at least people are aware, and the transparency point that Ali made is at least addressed, that people are aware that this is the kind of packages that government, this is the kind of safety nets the government is providing. And a second issue, just to something for us to think about, perhaps not to discuss when we're talking about the economy, is that at least in India, what's happened, I mean, inevitably when people are being forced to or willingly giving up their civil liberties to the state, the power of the state becomes extremely enhanced. And what that is doing in parts of India is that it is empowering our law and order to discriminate against against marginalized communities, the poor and the vulnerable, in ways that are something that we should worry about. So, maybe I'm coming at it from the lens of, right now, if a few people fatten their pockets, I'm not as worried as the fact that, the police are beating up workers, that beating up people on the streets, that, migrant workers are coming back to their villages and having chemicals sprayed on them because somebody decided that that's the way you can ensure that they get quarantined. So, the extent of state power is playing itself out in very different ways, which makes a little bit of stashing away some money somehow feel a little less problematic. But it could just be a consequence of the moment we're in.
Fair enough. Uzair, happy to hear your thoughts on all of this, but in particular, one of the other questions we have received that maybe you could speak to is whether we should expect governments using infrastructure expenditure, energy expenditure as a way of getting the economy going as well. So both for Pakistan and for South Asia, if you have any perspective on that, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so on the business side, I mean, look, there are already vested interests circulating around trying to get their share of the pie out of what the government is trying to announce. So overall, what the government so far has done is that it's announced 100 billion rupees in tax refunds that will be given out back to companies to ease their cash crunch. And Pakistan's government is notorious for holding back these tax refunds and not giving back them in due time. So I think that will help with the cash liquidity problem, at least immediately. And then there are 100 billion rupees set aside for deferred interest payments and principal payments, again, with the goal of reducing the cash and liquidity crunch that they have. My view has been, and I think I agree with the rest of the panelists, that in Pakistan, like the rest of South Asia, the small and medium enterprises, both formal and informal, are the largest employer. And you need to ease their liquidity crunch immediately. Many of those businesses are unbanked or underbanked, so reducing interest rates or giving them more facilities through the central bank will not really help. So what can you do then? Again, I go back to my point about the fact that most of, at least in the case of Pakistan, tax revenues are raised through indirect taxation. So can the government, at least for the next 3 months, 4 months, defer those tax payments that these businesses have, again, to ease their liquidity and ease their cash situation? Can you defer utility bill payments for these businesses again, and they can pay that later? And there are opportunities there, again, particularly for the informal segment, to say, okay, 3 months after when these bills are due that you need to pay, if you decide to join the formal economy and comply with the tax code, etc., these payments will be waived off because now you're part of the formal economy. Again, it's a give and take that I think we need to be creative about how to deal with small businesses here and rebuild that social contract. I think in terms of leakages in the case of Pakistan, that is a risk, but fundamentally, everyone across the political spectrum agrees that the Benazir Income Support Program, which is now part of the larger SAS program umbrella, works, and it works effectively, and the leakages are minimal there. So the testament to that is that when the People's Party government rolled that program out into about a decade or so ago, Nawaz Lee came in and they expanded it. the PTI came in and they were initially critical of it, but in the last two budgets they've presented, they've expanded this program as well, and they're expanding it further in this crisis. The new additions will be tricky, but I think even over there with the NADRA ID system, there is an opportunity, and I think they will do it rather effectively to make sure that the most vulnerable of people get access to the additional payments. And I think, again, I agree that, some leakages here and there in this moment of crisis will happen, but they should not forestall and the cash disbursement that needs to happen right now today. I think the bigger issue in the overall for particularly average citizens and vulnerable segments, I think across the region, especially in Pakistan, will be supply shocks. Whether that's hoarding or whether that's stuff running out like flour and like pulses, etc. The price shocks there actually will be far more dangerous overall, because you can be giving 12,000 rupees for ration, but if the price of staples doubles in that same period, then that money is not worth as much. And so the government has to keep that supply chain running. And I think you're seeing that strain in the logistics side in Pakistan as well. And there's concern that stuff is running out, not because that there is not enough food. It's just that people are buying. The rich who can afford to buy it are hoarding stuff up. And I think that's something that needs the government's attention. But overall, I think the important thing to consider here is that the whole of government approach is not enough here. And I agree with Ali's point that you can bring in NGOs, you can bring in other organizations, because what you need at this point in time is a whole of country approach, not a whole of government approach. So whether it's big business, small business, NGOs, multilateral institutions, foreign donors, what have you, they all need to play a part in this. And I think that's very, very important, especially given the reduced ability of an economy like Pakistan and its government to finance some of these programs. I don't think they can sustain that for long. On the infrastructure spending side, I think that is important for the medium term. And I think those projects need to be rolled out, particularly to absorb the excess labor. So the Pakistan government or some think tanks are estimating about 3 million people will be laid off when all is said and done, mostly in the informal segment of the economy. And so you need new projects that employ them and start the wheels running again. But I think in the near term, you can't really do much because people are scared of going out, and they should not be going out, right? So that money for now should be used for direct cash transfer payments. And yes, in the medium term, there is an opportunity to do larger infrastructure projects to absorb that excess labor and give them work to do, because that will be important in the medium term.
Okay, very good. So we're going to run out of time pretty soon. So I'm going to ask a set of questions that have come over from our audience, and I'd like you guys to pick and choose whichever ones you want, and then hopefully we can get 2 rounds of those. So first, moments of crisis are also potentially moments of reinvention, right? When you think Schumpeter's creative destruction analogy, that these are moments at which a government looking forward could potentially reinvent certain social programs, certain economic policies that in a normal time would have been very hard for them to reform. So for instance, one of the questions we've been asked is, given the plummeting price of energy, of oil, of LNG, and given that South Asia is an energy importing part of the world, is there an opportunity here for governments to reinvent sort of their policies about energy subsidies? Is it a possibility for them to reduce their fuel bills? Or in fact, should we worry that this is going to make it less likely that we'll see forward-looking investments in renewable energy sort of infrastructure, because in fact the price of importing oil has dropped? The second question is really whether or not, to take Uzair's last point, that it's not just whole of government, but whole of country, but arguably whole of region. In Europe, we're seeing a lot of calls for an EU-level fiscal response. In South Asia last week, we had the interesting scene of Prime Minister Modi calling on SAARC to really come together and talk about a regional approach, which is interesting, partly because India has always sort of, either neglected or sort of ignored SAARC, depending on one's perspective. Is there an opportunity here for a more regional framework to promote a South Asian economic recovery? Happy to let you guys decide which of those you'd want to take. Uzair, maybe you could start with the energy piece of that?
Yeah, so on the energy, I think it's hard. Like, for the time being, Pakistan's cut its orders from Qatar for LNG. Refineries are shutting down because they're at max capacity. So, I mean, I think that would be tricky in terms of what happens in the future, because overall, like the market is flooded with cheap oil, and there's only so much you can stock up, right? On the renewable energy front, I think that will be a function more of like how much capacity the government has moving forward to invest in new projects, and what the fiscal deficit looks like, and whether there is capacity to have a larger public sector development program on the renewable energy side. We don't know. The opportunity for Pakistan, however, is that for the past few decades, it has been stuck with these capacity payments and these guaranteed returns on equity for power plants that were set up under the independent power plant policy umbrella. I think this crisis opens up a door to have a renegotiation of these contracts, because everyone's struggling, including the companies, and so the government can force them at the table and have this negotiation right now. I think that is the only place I see the opportunity. And I think on the regional level, like, it works in Europe or North America or Southeast Asia because those economies are tightly integrated, right? A regional economic response doesn't really work when the supply chains aren't really integrated. And so, you know, whether it's India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, they're far more tightly joined to the hip with the European Union or the American market as far as their exports and supply chains are concerned than each other. So I think even beyond the political issues, especially between India and Pakistan, there isn't a lot of cross-border trade that can then be used to reinvigorate the economy. So that's just my 2 cents there.
Very good. Yeah.
Let me pick up
on the SARC question, or Ali?
Yeah, I mean, the SARC, I completely agree with that at this point, reinventing SARC is not the best course to do, because this is not going to help. You are going to spend more time and resources on that. This is not the time to do it. I mean, despite the fact that it sounds great, that is not going to work. And it should take more work than simply having a fund raised at the call of Prime Minister Modi or something of that. With respect to the energy sector, one of the things in case of Bangladesh, there's a huge subsidy that has been given to the private sector over the years. And that can be, rather, I would like to see that money being used in moving away and try to put it in this kind of situation where it would directly help the SME and the informal sector and the individual. I mentioned about involving the NGOs, not only NGOs, that is absolutely correct. Building a framework that would be involving everyone. And particularly in this respect, cash transfer in case of Bangladesh, there is one way that I can think of. I mean, pretty much everyone has the national ID. If the banking sector is used and asked to use that national ID to provide direct cash to the individual, that could be one way to put money in the market. And controlling the market is very much important. And I cannot agree more with you that if you are given 100 taka and then if it end up buying less than what you could a month ago, it's not going to help you. It's not, and that is what is happening in Bangladesh. It has taken this, the unscrupulous traders have taken this advantages and the price hike and then hoarding by those who can actually afford to. This has created a unusual scarcity and unnecessary scarcity and putting a pressure on the people who are most affected and least supported at this point. So those are the considerations that needs to be taken into account, that we need to build an overarching alliance of the private sector and the NGOs and whatever civil society organizations are there to address. And finally, one more point in case of Bangladesh, the one is the Rohingya refugees question. We haven't heard. That is a major issue in case of Bangladesh. That needs to be taken into account, how the government is going to support, how much the money would come from outside of this kind of situation. That is another whole different ball game that we cannot simply ignore because they are out there.
Yeah, thank you. Yamini, happy to get your thoughts on SARC in particular, but maybe there's less said about that, the better. Another question that has come though, and going back to really a point you made at the start, is India's chronic underinvestment in its public health system. Is this an opportunity to get the government to actually invest the resources required to beef up that system, or is it, unfortunately, is the overwhelming nature of this crisis going to mean that once again the public health training, investment in hard infrastructure is going to be ignored again?
So just a couple of things. On SARC, I echo the pessimism of my fellow panelists. But, I won't repeat what they've already said, but just one more piece to that. I think it was interesting that one of the first things that our Prime Minister did was to sort of convene this regional meeting. But the fact is that the trust deficit is just so significant right now. And that SARC as an institution has been beaten down so badly that I just don't know that we have the institutional levers to try and mobilize anything. But so this is not the time. It's brought SARC back into the conversation. The world order is going to look very different once everyone comes out of this. It's been interesting to me to see, even in Europe, though, how much countries are beginning to look so much inward to their governments. The nation state is dominant here. Interconnectedness is completely broken. We're closing down our borders. I don't think that's ever happened before, right? Across the globe. So I think the world is going to look very different, and therefore the nature of regional configurations as we come out of this crisis will look different, and some version of something will emerge. We just don't know what that is. But to the larger framing, crisis are moments of opportunity. Where do we see hope and where are we pessimistic? I think absolutely to the question on public health, I think that this is a real moment of hope and optimism, I feel. One of the big, Irfan, you know this better than anybody else, but any student of Indian politics always laments why education and health don't become serious issues of from a voter perspective. Why do politicians not care? Actually, the political economy of education has had some more movement than health. We've been stuck at less than 2% of GDP on health expenditure for a long time now. Everyone's talking about health now. Even the elite are beginning to get a sense of what a primary health center looks like. They never had this imagination before. The fact that our health systems are not ready to deal with the crisis, frankly, nowhere across the world are health systems ready, but in India it's become more acute, which in some ways I think legitimized the lockdown for the elite at any rate. This is all in conversation. How we handle this crisis is really going to, I think, shape what future of our health systems are going to look like. More investment is going to come. Whether we willingly make this investment in ways that are long-term and sustainable is an open question. But I think that the kind of focus on health right now is not something that is going to disappear. And that there I see a lot of hope. I also see some hope in the fact that no one has questioned the fact that at this moment in time, we need to be supporting with very expansive social protection. I mean, even your most hawkish economist is saying, forget fiscal deficit, do cash transfers, right? Again, you never. So in some ways, every right of center economist is going to balk at the fact that we are now a lot more welfareist than we have been in India, at least since 1991. How this gets leveraged going forward to strengthen the welfare state and to strengthen government's commitment to financing and improving and implementing a robust welfare state for India. I think, again, there is some optimism here. The other very thin silver lining that I'm beginning to see, India's informal workers that have been invisible are now on our TV screens and on our newspapers and are causing global shame for India, right? I mean, and I think the positive story that is going to come out of this is at least we're beginning to recognize that the casual laborer in India moves and they live in very difficult conditions, and we need to be thinking a little bit more again about how one can ensure that their conditions are improved and that there is a national social protection mechanism that strengthens them. So those are the areas where I see some degree of optimism. What I worry about and I'm very pessimistic about is not just in India, I think across the globe, you are seeing voluntarily giving up of civil liberties for state power in ways that with technology are deepening the surveillance capability and the power of the state. Right now, they are being, at least we think they're being used for the larger good. I mean, think about in ordinary times if your government says you can't leave your house, police is telling you to go right back in, would we accept that? Obviously, that's not going to, that may disappear, but that government is collected about all of us across the globe. I mean, it's no one is questioning the fact that our chief minister, in Delhi said that we are going to use mobile phones to survey whether people in quarantine are actually sticking to their quarantine. Somebody else rather smartly suggested that everyone who's in isolation should be taking in home isolation, self-isolation, should be taking pictures of themselves every hour and uploading them for government to be tracking them. So, I mean, and this is Korea, Singapore, Taiwan have all been hailed for being states that have at least avoided this kind of harsh lockdown, but it's because surveillance capability was so significant. So what does this mean for state-society relations going forward is a very, very big question mark. Also on economic freedoms, I mean, now we are talking about things like monetizing of deficits. Now, the RBI had spent a long time fighting against this. And it seems, I just saw a news snippet, C. Rangarajan, the RBI governor who had worked to try and get us on a different path, is now saying, well, we changed things around in the late 1990s, but we may need to go back to monetizing deficits going forward. So once you give up on these economic freedoms, what happens when things start normalizing? These are, again, areas of concern that we should keep our eyes and ears open for. I think in India, certainly, just the way in which we have planned our lockdown and the implications of that for how we view our governments and the kind of power the government is exercising over us is really something that we should worry about going forward. One last thing on the optimistic side is this could also be an opportunity, I think, to rethink our labor market. Now, there may be areas of the economy which require less human contact but are labor intensive. So for instance, the delivery, the big basket delivery, the sort of app-based delivery systems, are there ways in expanding that so that technology doesn't lead to reduction of labor, but different kinds of use of labor? We are experimenting so much right now that, maybe finding labor-intensive ways of using technology to boost parts of our economy could be an interesting place for us to end up in, since until about a month ago, we were all scratching our heads about Industry 4.0. Maybe here's something new may emerge here.
Very good. That's a wonderful, and we all need optimism. Let's hope that those sorts of ideas have a space. We're out of time, and I just want to summarize then, the challenge for South Asia, as is the challenge for the world, is really to imagine what the role of government is after many decades of denigrating the role of government in the economy and really rethinking state-society relations. I mean, in India, as in other parts of the world, but definitely again in South Asia, the pure proportion of population that lives on the margins of existence or in subsistence makes them uniquely vulnerable to the economic and health dislocations of COVID-19. And so we are very grateful that Yamini, Ali, and Uzair took the time this morning to join us this evening in Yamini's case, to join us to share their ideas. There's a lot more work that the Atlantic Council is doing. Please follow us at atlanticcouncil.org and also via Twitter. This week alone, the South Asia Center has published pieces on Bangladesh, on Pakistan, and yesterday an Experts React piece summarizing perspectives from 6 of our non-resident fellows on the economic stimulus package. There'll be more programming in the weeks to come, both at the Council and by the Center, to focus on the issues of technology, of surveillance, of civil liberties, and of democracy. And we hope that you will participate in all of those as well. So on behalf of all of my colleagues at the South Asia Center and of the Atlantic Council, thank you very, very much for participating today. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.